So if you're trying to find the sample size, just don't even do the assumptions and checks.
Yeah, you don't really need to, because think about it.
Yeah.
I don't know what the sample size is here for this one, and I have to make an assumption here. I used to make the class do it, but I don't know. If you're just doing sample size, you probably don't need to. All right, the book makes a kind of a funny comment here. You know, just about everything that we buy nowadays has warning labels on it. Your confidence interval should have warning labels on it. So that's what this section is about. Just cautions to keep in mind when you're doing confidence intervals. Number one. I mean, it's our number one assumption, and it's also the most important assumption we do. Okay? We have to have taken a simple random sample to have any confidence at all in this interval. Sean did everything right. He did everything right. He took a good simple random sample, but he happened to get an X bar that was a little wacky. Okay, remember, if you're doing a 95% confidence interval, 5% of these are going to lead to a confidence interval that does not capture the real mean. Sean got one of them. So it's hard enough if you're doing everything right. But now think for a second. Let's say you take a bad sample. And you're sitting outside Republican headquarters for the election results, for your election poll. Well, of course you're going to get a crazy p-hat or X-bar. Okay? So you must take a good random sample in order to have that 95% chance of capturing the true proportion. Okay? So you want to make sure there's no bias. Like, for example, that homework problem you had that had the non-response bias. You don't want any convenience bias. You don't want to be systematically favoring a high X-bar or a low X-bar. All right, there's other kinds of sampling techniques that we've talked about that are not simple random samples. If you remember way back in chapter whatever, there was this thing called a stratified sampling technique. That just meant you put them in groups, like boys and girls, and then you randomly picked out of them. Or a multi-stage sampling. That was the one where, like, okay, you got all the states, and you put them in a hat, and you pick out some states, and then you go into those states, and you pick out randomly some counties. Then you go into those counties, and you would randomly pick some streets, and you'd go to those streets and interview those people. Okay? These are viable techniques. They're not a simple random sample, but they're okay techniques. The deal with these is it's a different formula they use. They don't use that formula. Okay, so this formula only works if we did a good simple random sample. So take your time on this assumption. Make sure you got it. How many of you caught that on number 6? You should have. You should have made note of it. Remember what outliers do? I mean, let's say I get my sample of 20 names, and I don't know, who's got the longest name in the school? Okay, like it's 47 letters in his name, right? So, what's going to happen to the X bar if I have Noah? Is it Noah? What's going to happen to the X bar if I get Noah's name? What does the sample mean do with outliers? Go back to chapter 1. We talked about being resistant and non-resistant, right? So if I get an outlier, the X bar just is in love with it, right? It runs to the outlier. Whereas the median could care less, it stays in the middle. So what they're saying here is just be careful. If you do get an outlier, just understand it's going to have a big time effect on your X bar. Make sure it's legit. I mean, make sure maybe I didn't have 2 names on here and you're counting too many letters, because that one outlier will mess up everything if it's not legit. So just verify, make sure that outlier belongs. All right, a lot of you have called me on this issue, and it's legit. All right, go back to the warm-up, right? This is some national test that's going to happen. It hasn't even happened yet. Of course I don't know what the mean grade on that test is going to be. Well, how in the world do I know how spread out all those test grades are? You don't. You're never going to know. You don't know this. Why are you giving me this if I don't know this? Okay, so they're just pointing out, be aware. Okay, this doesn't seem really very realistic. Okay, we're going to take care of that in a couple of chapters, but just understand, I don't understand how we can have that number. That's okay. All right, the last one. This is very confusing for a lot of people. Our book is just so anal about this concept. You have several multiple choice questions. where you're going to miss it if you don't understand this concept. I've seen this concept on the AP test in May, but it's weird. Okay, I say it's okay if you say it like this. Before drawing my sample, 95% of the X bars will create a confidence interval that captures the true mean. I say that's okay. It's also okay for you to say this. The 95% confidence interval is. But you are not allowed to say this. The probability is 95% that the true mean falls in that interval. You cannot say that. And here's why. Okay. What if you have Sean Ha's interval? Does this statement make sense if you're sitting with Sean Ha's interval? Can he say, yeah, the probability is 95%, I got the real mean? What is the probability that Sean's got the real mean? 0. Once you've got that one particular interval, it's either 0 or 100%. Let me give you another example. Before someone has a baby, you'd say, oh yeah, there's a 50% chance of having a boy. Once they have the baby, you say, yeah, there's a 50% chance you're a boy. Doesn't make sense, right? You wouldn't say the probability is 50% you're... So you get the subtle wording here. Once you've got the interval, you can't say what the probability is anymore. And that's why we word it like this. I mean, you don't ever see this wording in your book or anything, but that's why I word it like this, so that hopefully you'll understand that concept a little better. Does that make sense? Questions? Comments? Yeah?
So when you're doing your simple problem sample assumption, and it is a multi-stage, you could...
Yeah, so here's what we're going to do here. You're going to call them out on it here. Okay, you're going to say, I don't like this sampling technique. You're going to tell me why. And then you're just going to say this is a cause for concern. And what we're saying is, I'm concerned that I didn't just get a bad X bar here. But we're going to keep going, okay? But just make note of it. Tell me what your issues are, what potential biases you see. You say, oh, well, only 100 of the questionnaires came back. The other 60, may have gone a certain direction, and that could lead to a bias. So just make note of it, write it up here, but keep going. Okay?